This is episode 24 of Living Outside the Matrix from lawfulrebel.com.
Lawful Rebel!
Comprehensive goals.
Lawful Rebel!
Active minds, open doors.
Lawful Rebel!
You can see the signs if you read between the lines.
Hello, welcome to Living Outside the Matrix, the podcast where we challenge assumptions of the mainstream narrative by exposing it to rigorous critical thinking. Hi there, I'm your host, NIgel Howitt, and on the show today it's my very great pleasure and honour to be joined by Dr David Kelley from the Atlas Society. Dr Kelley is a professional philosopher of the last 50 years. He's a teacher and a best-selling author. He founded the Atlas Society in 1990, previously known as the Society for Objectivist Studies, and he served there at the helm until 2012. He's written several books: Unrugged Individualism, The Contested Legacy of Ayn Rand, The Art of Reasoning, a well-known textbook in logic and thinking, and A Life of One's Own. David, a very warm welcome to the show.
Thank you, Nigel. It's a pleasure to be here.
David, perhaps you can kick us off by giving us a little bit about your background and particularly how you got into philosophy, a little bit of just who you are as the man, as it were, before we delve into philosophy and objectivism.
So I got interested in philosophy when I was in high school, teenager. It just seemed to be the natural bent of my mind to be curious about questions like, I mean, at one time or another, I thought about free will. I would look at the stars and think, does the universe go on forever? Or does it have a boundary? And if so, what could that be like? I mean, it was that was just the drift of my thoughts. And so I like the subjects that, the topics that we covered in English and talked about: human relationships and feelings and goals and values. But I also like the methods of the sciences and mathematics. And at some point, thinking about what I wanted to study in college, I thought, well, philosophy deals with the subjects I like, the topics I like, but it does so with a method that tries to establish them as true, not just to live inside a novel for a while and talk about it, but actually to think what ideas are true. So I went to college intending to major in philosophy, which I did. And then I wasn't quite done, so I went to graduate school and got a doctorate, and then taught for about 10 years after graduate school.
Okay, and I mean, obviously you've been in philosophy for 50 years, I gather, and maybe you can tell us a little bit about your dealings with objectivism. I'm speaking to you as somebody who's discovered Ayn Rand and objectivism relatively late in life. I've been familiar with those ideas for about 2 years now, but you've obviously been right in there in the thick of it. So would you be able to give us a sort of a broad picture, a very brief broad picture of sort of what philosophy looks at, and then maybe we can move on to sort of singling out objectivism and perhaps the way it differs from other philosophical schools of thought?
Yes, certainly. Philosophy in general has certain traditional divisions or branches. The two really fundamental ones are metaphysics and epistemology. Metaphysics is about what the world's like. Is the world of nature that we see around us, is that all, or is there another dimension somehow, or a God, or a personal God? And metaphysics also includes the fundamental issues about human nature. Do we have free will? Do we? How do our cognitive faculties relate to our emotional faculties? Is there an inherent clash? That's been a kind of a constant theme going back to Plato in ancient Greece. So, and then epistemology is a study of knowledge. Episteme, it's a Greek word for knowledge. It's a study of how we know. Can we be certain? Can we trust the evidence of our senses? How do we form concepts and abstract ideas that lie behind our use of language? So those are branches of philosophy that we could call descriptive. They deal with the nature of the universe and the nature of our knowledge. Then we get into the normative areas, ethics. What are there objective values, and if so, what are they? How do you establish them? What's a good life? What character traits are worthy, and how should we? What are the principles we should act in accordance with when we deal with other people? Which leads then into politics, political philosophy about the role of the individual and society. And then there are others, narrower disciplines. One of the classic ones is aesthetics, philosophical aesthetics. Why does every culture and most individual human beings feel a need and appreciation for art? What does art do for us? Why do we make up stories or look at paintings of stuff that never happened? So those are that's the broad terrain that philosophy covers. And Ayn Rand was very interesting because she was a systematic thinker who had something to say about each and every one of those branches.
And obviously her thinking quite radically challenged the conventional thinking of each of those branches as well. I mean, you could say that it was really turned a lot of it on its head. So you were obviously drawn into the objectivist philosophy quite early on. It was actually just coming about, wasn't it, in the early 60s, born out of the Atlas Shrugged novel, of course.
Yes, I was graduated high school in 1967, and I had come across Ayn Rand's writings. They really had an impact on me, both intellectually and in terms of a vision of how to live. Like a lot of people that age, in my teens, I was wrestling with questions about, starting to think for myself and wondering what I wanted out of life and so forth. So anyway, I began reading The Fountainhead first, then Atlas Shrugged, and I think by the time I went to college, I had read everything that she had written up to that point, or everything that was published anyway. And it just it had made a huge impact on me. But I also realized that I was, as I sometimes say, I was just a high school kid, So I figured I would learn a lot more. But the ideas stood the test of time for me as I confronted other ideas in college and grad school.
So you obviously became a part of the objectivist movement, I suppose we would call it, and then branching off, you obviously set up what was initially called the Institute for Objectivist Studies, I believe, and changing its name to the Atlas Society. Not to dwell on any differences there with other people within the movement, but that society carried on and is still going today, 50 years later, I believe.
Yes, I was as I was in graduate school and then a professional professor of philosophy. I got to know some of the other people around Ayn Rand. She was still alive in the 70s. I met her a few times myself, and so we were colleagues. We spent a lot of time talking. We learned from each other, and then after Ayn Rand passed away in 1982, shortly thereafter, people began getting ideas. How can we organize? How can we do something to promote these ideas more effectively? And that led to the creation of the Ayn Rand Institute in 1985. I worked with them for several years, but for various reasons, toward the end of that decade, I began to feel that the movement was becoming too insular, too judgmental and exclusionary. And one thing led to another, and I felt finally, it was time to break off. But I didn't want to continue what I thought, to promote this incredible philosophy, this incredibly rich, intellectually and personally rich philosophy. So in 1990, I started the Institute for Objectivist Studies. So we've been, we're in our 28th year, and looks like we're going to stay around for a while. We've got a great new CEO.
Indeed, and as hopefully, I'm sure you and I share the ideal that these ideas will take further root and hopefully blossom. David, just to give you a little bit of an insight into my come from in all of this, and indeed the listeners. The podcast Living Outside the Matrix and the website lawfulrebel.com is all about the idea of challenging, looking around at our culture and really challenging the assumptions of that culture, asking questions about the root generalizations and premises that most people are sort of almost unconsciously choosing actions from. So my come from is really strongly around sort of thinking for ourselves, or thinking for oneself, I should say, in the pursuit of intellectual sovereignty. So I've found that the discovery of objectivism to be extremely helpful. I've worked for 25 years as an airline pilot, and I'm familiar with the idea of connecting accurately with reality. The only way you can land an aeroplane is to know that you're perceiving reality accurately, and also the notion of prioritizing, of actually looking at what's important and what can we deal with later. So this is my come from. When I picked up Ayn Rand's philosophy, I found that this was spectacularly in line with my own thinking, even though I wasn't aware of it. And what really fascinates me is that I noticed in my surrounding culture a sort of an ever-increasing tendency towards this mysticism, and I noticed it starting to happen to me as well. So this is what I'm passionate about, trying to address this cultural shift further into mysticism. So maybe you can share some of your insights about objectivism, and in that Ayn Rand, I recall, suggested that it's the intellectuals that steer the cultural assumptions, the dominant philosophical assumptions, shall we say, and then culture tends to follow that with some degree of time lag. And maybe you could speak into that, because I'm sure you're very, very keen that culture is steered towards a greater degree of rationality.
Oh, absolutely, yes. And I feel very strongly about that, and in part because epistemology, the understanding of knowledge, is my specialty in philosophy. And I taught logic. I have a logic textbook that I've written and used in colleges. That if I can teach people to think, I feel like I've done a good day's work, or
absolutely
up to maybe even a good life's work. But so rationality is. When you say I'm in favor of reason, who's going to argue with that? Who's going to deny that? Most people say, well, of course I use my mind. I go shopping. I make a list. I figure out, do I have enough money? I'm thinking. But when it comes to the deeper issues in life, people do often get off the rails. And, there are unpleasant facts to deal with sometimes, often. In everyone's life, there are times when that happens. You don't want to recognize something is true, or you just feel, what if, or I wish. And those are the moments when you need a clear sense of rationality. That rationality means looking at reality. It means always acting from the commitment that you want the facts. Facts are facts, and they're your friends. You never win by evading facts. You might get away in the short term. It's going to catch up with you. And it's going to catch up with you in the circumstances of your life, with the actual results that are going to happen if you ignore facts, but also in your character. Your mind is your most precious tool, and when you don't use it properly, when you don't maintain it, and it weakens. It's like any skill, you know and have written a lot about health. If you're not treating your body right, it's going to stop working for you. Well, that's even more true of your mind. It's the most delicate instrument in nature, as far as we know. So that's why I feel it's hugely important. But then the other thing is, and this is where Rand really stood out, when she talked about self-interest, pursuing your own life and happiness as the highest value, because that really does go against the grain of what a lot of people think is morally correct, morally right. So we can, if you want to go into that. Yeah.
Well, yeah, I was going to come into self-interest. Maybe this is a good time to go into that. The fact that selfishness, the virtue of selfishness, obviously a centerpiece of Ayn Rand's ethics, is a really difficult one for a lot of people to swallow. And when I've mentioned that to friends and colleagues, who are steeped in their mainstream culture, and all around us is conditioning to be thy brother's keeper, and all of this from the religious inheritance, and it seems to be all around us, and people always raise an eyebrow. That seems to be a very, very difficult one to embrace, doesn't it? The idea of being rationally self-interested, but it seems to me that a lot of people don't quite grasp that it's rationally in our self-interest to be kind, to be generous, to be considerate, and we don't need to cling to the altruist morality. So there's a big mix-up there, isn't there? Maybe you can enlighten us with that.
Well, yes, I think there is, and it goes back to a picture, actually a dichotomy that people have in their minds, that to be selfish, to be self-interested, is to be exploitative, grasping, ambitious, walk all over people to get what you want. And there are people like that, and they're not nice, and they're not good. Because that is the picture of what selfishness is, people say, okay, well then we have to avoid that. And how do we avoid it? Well, if the essence of a selfish person is acting for his self-interest, then the better course would be act for the interest of other people. And from that we get, be your brother's keeper. The fundamental problem is that's a false dichotomy. And everyone knows it in their lives, almost everyone. I mean, there are maybe a few genuine 100% altruists around it. But most people, they want things in life. They want success, happiness, family, love, all those things. And what are those? Those are values that you have and that you enjoy. And what Rand was saying was, look, think about it. You have a life. It's the only life you have, and only you have that life. That you can't live, literally, you cannot live for someone else. You can help someone else, you can have, people you love, people you're friends with, partners in business, all kinds of relationships with other people, but ultimately you are the center of that relationship, and those relationships contribute to your life. So the question is, how do we define what is best for us? And this is where the rational part of rational selfishness comes in, because acting just on the impulse of the moment, or living just to acquire as much money as you can, those are truncated lives. They're not successful. They're not actually good for the person. Those people are, in a sense, are not being selfish enough, because they're not aware enough of what their real needs are and what would actually add to their life in a genuine sense. But on the other hand, that form of rational selfishness is totally consistent with what I call benevolence. That is the attitude toward people that, I'm an individual. I recognize you are too. So I'm going to treat you with that respect. I don't expect you to serve me. That's why we say please and thank you at the dinner table. You pass me the salt. You didn't have to do that, right? But all the way up to the more fundamental, larger things in life. So benevolence means, and excuse me, benevolence can include generosity, extending a helping hand when there are limits to that in Rand's thinking and in objectivist thinking. You don't sacrifice your own interests, but they're all of us have circumstances where we can help someone at minimal expense or minimal effort and make a big difference. Someone has a car accident on the road and you're passing by, you stop and call the ambulance or the police or whatever. I mean, come on. if you respect human life at all, you have to respect. And of course, when you get into deep personal relationships, I mean, love is incredibly important. But the question we always ask when people say, if you're in love, you can't be selfish. Well, imagine you're in love with someone and he or she comes and says, I'm just in this out of, sympathy for you. Kind of, I feel sorry for you, so, I'm going to help you.
Yep.
Who would want to hear that?
Absolutely.
What you want is a relationship where you both realize how important you are to each other. There's the problem, though, culturally speaking, is people seem so locked into that false dichotomy I was talking about, and it's very hard. I mean, I've lectured on this. I've heard other objectivists give really, really great lectures about this, explaining it all, and some people will get it. Sure, I mean, there are a lot of people who were impacted by Rand, and including by that aspect of her thought. But it's an uphill battle.
It is, and there's also the issue of the practicality of this altruist philosophy. Where the root of it is basically sort of self-sacrifice, isn't it? It's more than just being nice to people. It's more than helping people. It's when you really get to the root of it, it's otherism, in that the other is more important than self. And I'm familiar with this concept, obviously in the aeroplane sort of decompression scenario, where passengers are repeatedly reminded that they must reach for their own oxygen mask first in order to be in a position to actually help anybody. So even if you've got your children next to you, your nearest and dearest, if you try to simply give without first attending to your own needs, in that scenario, it's quite obvious to see the very practical nature of first dealing rationally with your own needs, and this obviously extends into all areas of life, doesn't it? But I think most people fail to see that.
Yes, I mean, it's interesting, having worked as a pilot all these years, that would be a very familiar example to you. But, we've all flown and we've all heard that. And, in talking with people about objectivism, that's a common analogy that we use. And it does have one limit, though, philosophically, in that the rationale, someone could say, okay, yes, you can't help anyone if you're not alive. So you have to maintain yourself in order to help others. It wouldn't do your child any good to have oxygen on and you suffocate to death. That would be a pretty bad thing for the kid. So, however, that leaves open the idea that some altruists have, that you maintain yourself and pursue your self-interest to that extent, but for the sake of a higher purpose of serving others.
I see. Yeah, absolutely.
And right, so that's where I think I would move away from that analogy a bit. I mean, it's great. It's a perfect example of an essential point. But there's then the other essential point that even you're not maintaining yourself in just for the sake of helping others.
No,
but for your own
absolutely.
sake,
It comes
ultimately.
back to that right to live for your own sake, doesn't it? That each man is an end in itself. That's I guess the point that you're alluding to there.
Exactly. Yes. Yes. And Rand, she often put her view in a summary form as saying every individual is an end in himself. And that's a common phrase, and it's used, in many political philosophies, many ethical philosophies. But when you think of it, when you know where that comes from in her thought, it really carries a whole way of thinking about what's right and
What do you mean by where that? What do you mean by where that comes from in her thought, Dave?
Well, Rand was, she was an individualist, to use a term, and in fact, that was the name she adopted first. I mean, the name of her thought system, a new individualism, before she came up with the name Objectivism. But as an individualist, she said, she really was saying that has two elements. It means living by the judgment of your own mind, independence. But also, it means living for your own life. And that's the egoist or self-interested part. And I think one of her insights is you can't have one without the other. If you
you can't have your own life. Sorry, you can't have your own life without thinking for yourself and being intellectually independent. Is that what you mean?
Yes, exactly, right. And you can't be truly independent in your thinking unless you are committed to your own mind and your own life as high values. Because if someone else or some cause or whatever is more important to you than your life, then you have to focus. Your mind has to be. You have to adapt your mind to what that cause wants of you. What God says or what the majority says, and that's a block and a limit to your own independent thinking.
Indeed, and
so it goes both ways.
Go on. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. If you're going.
So the point it goes both ways. You can't be independent without being in thought and action, without being an egoist, without pursuing and valuing your own life. And you can't value your own life rationally unless you are independent in your thinking. So it's they go together. Those two aspects of individualism.
Indeed, and again, from my come from here, from the podcast "Living Outside the Matrix," it's very much behoves people these days to be independent or individualistic in their thinking, because there seem to be so many untruths around. There seem to be so many traps that we can fall into, which just for a quick example, in the arena of health, things like the myth that fat makes you fat, or that cholesterol causes heart disease, or even that mercury amalgam fillings in your mouth are safe. If we, unless we are pursuing that that rational self-interest of independent thinking and individualism, we're less likely to come across these very, very beneficial truths. So to me that makes individualism a very, very practical necessity today, you could say.
Oh, I agree completely, and it relates to an issue that is often raised when we talk about independent thinking, because the critics of that point of view would say, well, look, did you go to a doctor and you take the doctor's advice, you go to a mechanic to fix your car, you're always trusting other people you're counting on other people's knowledge rather than just exclusively your own. But actually, my answer to this, and I think it goes along with what you were saying, is no. Yes, we have a wonderful division of labor through language and learning and the progress of knowledge. We all have access to a body of enormous body of knowledge that none of us could have discovered all on our own. But
amazing.
It is amazing. But the burden then becomes you finding your way by your own mind in that stream and universe of information. Picking, do you trust one doctor? How do you find the doctor you want to go to? If you're lazy, you just go to the doctor your family goes to. But if you're really rational and concerned about your health, you want to find out some information, and so it still comes back to you.
Indeed.
If
I could just interject there, another one of the insights that I got from Ayn Rand and from Objectivism was this idea of context being so important. I'd never fully appreciated the idea that knowledge doesn't really exist outside of any context. If you have no context, knowledge is irrelevant. How to grow raspberries in the middle of the Sahara Desert is just completely irrelevant. and the idea that today, I think the context is also important in that there's such a wash of information, good information over the internet, the library on the ether, fantastic. But there's also a huge wash of disinformation, and it seems to me that the challenge, of course, is to try to distinguish, fact from fiction and what's real from what's unreal. And I got an awful lot from the Objectivism with this idea of keeping everything in context, and I mean this is. You were talking about your choice of doctor and so forth, but today it seems to have broadened out even beyond that, because there seems to be so many strands of disinformation even within the medical fraternity. So this might sort of cause a lot of people to just sort of think, what, I just can't cope. But the idea of context, I found it fascinating with Objectivism.
Yes, and that's a very important part. People. Knowledge doesn't consist of just isolated bits of information, and a big part of thinking and trying to find the grains of truth in the in the swamp of disinformation and rumor and that's out there sometimes. The first question to ask is something said, you hear something, a claim is made. The first thing to do is say, does that conflict with anything that I know firsthand, anything I really do understand? So, to take one example, it gets into, controversial political issues, but someone says, maybe we should raise the minimum wage because, hey, these workers in Seattle or wherever are, it's hard to have a good standard of living at that, that minimum wage with what they're making. But, a lot of people will say, oh, yeah, well, that sounds good. Yeah, let's help those guys out. But then you should step back and say, wait a minute, does this work with what economics tells us about markets? If you raise the wages, the cost of labor, you think that's not going to have any effect on employers? This is coming from my own objectivist view of free market economics. Not everyone would have those same principles, but the point I'm making is you hear stuff, but you got to see, does this fit? Does this make any sense at all? And then the next question is, if it still seems possible, this information, how do I find out? How do I confirm or disconfirm it? I mean, it's really literally critical thinking, and not being passive or lazy.
It is. I'm fascinated. You alluded earlier to the fact that you teach thinking, and I made a mental note then that one of my concerns is that critical thinking, or any kind of thinking really, rational thinking, is completely absent in mainstream education, and this is where we've really got a battle on our hands in terms of spreading useful philosophical ideas and insights, and trying to sort of cast these seeds out there amongst a population where there really are quite few thinkers, unfortunately, to pick up these ideas of context and rational self-interest and so forth.
I'm glad you raised the issue of education, because that is an arena, maybe quite possibly the most important arena, in which help advance, the ideas and the culture of independence and responsibility and thinking. Because I've seen a lot. I taught college at the beginning of my career for 10 years, and I've been working with students, in various contexts for a long time. And the quality of their preparation before they get to the college level, which is the one I'm familiar with, the quality of their preparation has really declined. And I think part of that is they're given information that they have to remember by rote, but they're not given a context. Sometimes they're taught what it's called critical thinking, think for yourself, but they're not really taught the standards or the background of knowledge you have to have in order to be genuinely thoughtful. And so I think that's, the philosophy of education would be a ripe one to, and the actual, I'm not talking about private versus public education. That's an economic and political issue, but I'm talking about the pedagogy of teaching, which I think it's declined over the course of my life, and I maybe was declining beforehand. But I think there's enormous scope for improvement.
Absolutely. Obviously, education, getting the young people and teaching them how to think it's got to be where any change is really going to come about through that focus. Maybe we can come back into education in a moment, but I just wanted to ask you that. Coming back to Rand's sort of insight that we need to sort of steer culture away intellectually, to start with the intellectuals, away from the mysticism and the altruism, back towards egoism and reason. Do you see any evidence of that happening? From your perspective, obviously in the States, from your window on the world, do you see some evidence of that changing? Obviously, your organisation and the ARI helping in that respect. Is there cause for a celebration, for optimism?
Not yet. One of the things. First of all, I have to make a distinction. Rand's view was that philosophical ideas that are prominent at a given point in time in a society tend to be the ultimate fundamental drivers of what happens culturally and politically. And I think there's a excellent case for that. And then, of course, I mean, who is it that comes up with the philosophical ideas and promotes them? Well, it tends to be intellectuals. But it's a further step to say, and that means university professors. John Locke was not a university professor, as far as I know. He was probably I think about how huge an impact he had. Karl Marx was not a university professor. He had a huge impact on the other side of the of the spectrum. So
that's kind of encouraging. If I can just interject there, that's kind of encouraging because it means that that sort of platform and writing and thinking isn't necessarily the exclusive purveyor of the university class. So that I'm taking that as a positive.
Yes, that is positive as an option. But just now speaking of the university, the professional intellectuals, academic intellectuals, unfortunately, at least in the humanities and to some extent the social sciences, there has been a movement into postmodernism. This view that objectivity is impossible. Ideas are set by culture and society, not by grasping reality as it is. We can't grasp reality as it is. That we're all our thinking and our minds are all shaped by the language that's abroad, and when you combine that with political correctness, that's why we have speech codes. You can't say this or that because it actually will affect other people's minds. So that is a very bad. That's a form of mysticism in my view. It's skeptical, and one of Ayn Rand's great insights is that mystics, on the one hand, who claim they have a magic means of acquiring knowledge, and skeptics, on the other hand, who say, we can't even trust our rational knowledge. They're brothers under the skin because they both reject the idea of objectivity, rationality, that there's knowledge doesn't come free, but it's not impossible. You just have to work for it. That's what that's the right way to think about it. So the postmodern people, I think, have had a very bad effect, and in those fields where they dominate, the students are really getting a bad deal at the university level. And I think I don't know as much about secondary education prior to university, but I have certainly heard things that this attitude is seeping down, so to speak, or seeping out from universities.
So would you say that postmodernism is therefore the predominant? Is that what you're saying? That's the predominant sort of view that's being foisted on people at the moment.
Yes, it waxes and wanes. I mean, postmodernism became the original ideas. It were emerging in the 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, and so there are a lot of critics of it. And actually, in my own field in philosophy, at least in the Anglo-American world, I think most philosophers have more sense. They know that ultimately it's self-refuting to say we can't know anything because you're expressing what you take to be a piece of knowledge in that very statement. But it is still a pervasive attitude. I mean, and when you look at what, in the U.S., I don't know if this is happening to the same extent in Great Britain, but in the U.S. we've had a rash of incidents on college campuses of speakers being shut down, students demanding safe spaces where they don't have to hear ideas that they don't agree with. Where does that come from? It comes from this, I think fundamentally postmodern, skeptical, and collectivist mindset.
Afraid of ideas.
So we have a lot of work to do.
Yeah, I mean, excuse me. The idea of knowledge, obviously epistemology being your speciality, what I notice from around my culture here in the UK is that a lot of people don't really believe that they can know. That they have this fundamental philosophical premise that they're unaware of even, and they don't believe. They've obviously absorbed this from our culture, and it probably alludes to this postmodern influence. And there's a general perception that it is impossible to know. What can I know? Only me. Even the scientists disagree. I've heard some people say, and how can anybody know? And I find that that's something that I passionately want to challenge. I want to somehow spread the idea that, come on, guys, we can know. If we start rubbing some grey matter together, we can know. But I suppose it's that sort of subjective and mystic ingredient that sort of short circuits the belief that you can know, because obviously you're very familiar, the idea that if there's a sort of a shortcut to knowledge, as you said earlier, then why bother thinking, and the whole subjectivism, if you sort of make up your own reality anyway, why bother thinking? How do you think we can address that? Is it going to be back to education? I suppose that's the only way to approach it, really, isn't it?
Certainly education, but there are other things. I mean, we have in both our countries, we have a welfare state. We have the safety net, so-called, and so people can get away with a certain amount of irrationality and irresponsibility, and we're talking. There's a responsibility in life in acting to achieve things and to be aware of possible consequences and dangers and be responsible about that. But there's also underlying that is responsibility of thinking. It's work. It takes work, and
takes effort, doesn't it?
I mean, a lot of people, when you really sit down and look at it, there's no such thing as a free lunch. They'll say, okay, that they see something, some advertisement for something, some new method you can earn, $10,000 a month. I said, well, now that sounds like a get-rich-quick scheme, and probably, at least I can't put a percentage, but a lot of people anyway get that. You don't get rich quick. You can do something and have a surprising, sudden success, but didn't just fall out of the sky. Well, I think a lot of mysticism is belief. I want to get certain quick. It's get quick certainty.
Yep.
It's in the Bible, or it's in the New York Times. Okay. From your mouth to my ear. Now I know, and it's the same belief in consequences happening without effort, without taking action and responsibility, and that, I think, is an attitude that if you look at most small babies, toddlers. I mean, I don't have kids myself, so I'm not speaking from a vast amount of experience, but they seem to want to know things. They're curious, and they're crawling around, they're walking around, trying this and that. I think there is something in the human mind and the nature of our the way we're designed, so to speak, but the way our nature. There's something in that you actually have to do something to stop it, to kill it.
Yeah.
Because if you just thought, if you think about a baby, take a 2-year-old. This I do know a little bit about 2-year-olds as they're acquiring language are learning something like I forget the actual number, but it's like 8 or 10 words a day, 8 or 10 concepts every day. Their minds are going. You and I at our age probably, well, you're not my age yet, but as adults, we couldn't keep up that pace, almost certainly. But I mean, they drink in knowledge, and why would that ever stop? Well, you have to do something to make it boring or threatening or whatever. So I'm, in that sense, I'm an optimist about human nature, fundamental human nature. And if parents and teachers, everyone would just do everything they can to say, that's the spark of life, that's the spark of thought, and that's the most precious thing. I'm going to protect that, whatever else happens. in my child.
Absolutely. I'm a key advocate of homeschooling because one of the things, the destructive things I see in the educational system, particularly in the UK and probably similarly in the States, is that it seems to drum that sense of curiosity out of children. You know, there are many things about the educational system that are wrong, but I think ultimately young people come out of the school system in this country sort of, you know, punch drunk from having things stuffed in. You know, as you mentioned earlier, the memorizing of facts rather than the understanding of them, rather than joining dots in their head and gaining an understanding with a context. You know, it's just stuffing in pointless, unrelated facts in falsely compartmentalized subjects. So there's a whole area of problems there, I think, with the mainstream educational system. But yeah, that spark of curiosity really is the future. So, David, how do you think, in terms of looking to the future for solutions and trying to tie things up in an optimistic note, how do you think, and you know, with your activities with the Atlas Society, how do you think it's best for us to focus our efforts, if you like, in order to spread the benefits of rational thinking, of objectivism? What do you think are some of the things we can do?
I have focused primarily on teaching thinking. Through I have a logic textbook. It's called The Art of Reasoning, and that's how I really think of it. There's a technical logic, mathematical logic, and that's a subject of study, quite interesting in its own right. But the art of thinking is using your mind in accordance with good methods of inference and avoiding fallacies and so forth. So that's one thing, and I think that should be taught. I mean, I'm always a little embarrassed that my book is used in colleges. It should be used in high school or earlier. That's when, you know, people most need it.
Absolutely. I confess to not having read that yet, although I'm going to, from what you say. Is it written? You know, is it accessible? Do you think to the younger mind?
I think so. Some of the examples are geared to the college level, college age, let's say. You know, I'd like to use examples that relate to how people's lives. So, for example, you know, college kids are exploring their romantic and sexual natures and experiences. Some of that. So I don't go. You know, there's nothing pornographic in the book, but there's you know, I have examples that I might not be appropriate for like a 14-year-old or something. But this is, in terms of the writing, it's an introductory book. It doesn't have any presuppositions in terms of knowing about logic. When I was in school, they still taught us grammar in the sense we had to diagram sentences. We had to know all the parts of speech. We had to be able to take a complex sentence and, you know, diagram it into a certain kind of grammatical tree. And maybe some schools still do that. But anyway, the logic in my book is no more difficult than that.
Great. It sounds fantastic. I'm fascinated as well with the idea of thinking, and I mean, you maybe have some insights to this. I'm familiar with the course on efficient thinking that Barbara Brandon gave, you know, back in the NBI days, and I'm familiar with some of the concepts that were alluded to there. Did you pick up on any of those? Obviously, being a fellow objectivist, are some of those strands some that you've taken, you know, with your thinking and with your textbook?
You know, that's a very good question, and it's kind of coincidental you raised it. That course was the first course on objectivism, first lecture tape series that I heard. I was still in high school. I have to believe that somehow I was absorbing it, or we were coming to, you know, parallel conclusions. We both had the same teacher in Ayn Rand. So I'll see. But it sounds like you like the you like the.
Again, I've got something that things like the idea of integrating all our ideas into a cohesive, non-contradictory sum. And so much of the time, you just a cursory glance around in our culture, you find that people's heads are full of contradictions. In as much as I might talk to somebody and we might agree that I have no right to make them get down and do 50 press-ups or make them do anything, and yet that person, although agreeing that we have no right to coerce each other, might be all for government controls and taxation, for example, or coercive measures on a sort of a macro scale that are in fact a contradiction of the very principle that they've agreed on an interpersonal scale. So I was fascinated to come up against this idea of deliberately integrating thoughts. That was just one of the many insights that I got from that particular course.
The idea of integrating into a coherent context is how you get a context of knowledge that you can trust in the first place. And so that you then have it when we were talking earlier about you come across new information or new claims, and you don't know exactly, is it really information or disinformation? When you ask yourself that question and trying to ask how it fits, what you're doing is what Barbara was describing. You're trying to see, does this integrate without not contradiction into a larger body of knowledge?
Yeah, and I mean, I tie that into this idea of living outside the matrix. This idea of thinking for ourselves is about when I research a particular topic, I make the analogy of seeing all these little arrows all pointing in one direction, and if you see enough little arrows all pointing to the truth, you build up a contextual picture, don't you? And then you can spot the odd arrow that's pointing over there, and you think, well, why is that one contradicting all the others? And again, it comes down to that fundamental principle that in reality there's no such thing as a contradiction. You can't, an apple can't fall up and fall down, and you can't walk off in two different directions at once. So it's very useful to bring these objectivist principles right into our everyday life in order to get a clearer picture of truth, so we can plan our lives appropriately.
If people just took what you said just now and lived it, that would solve a ton of problems. That would solve so many of the world's problems. Just that. So,
as you've obviously wound up your career with the Atlas Society, is that where you see yourself going, pursuing the thinking and teaching thinking?
Certainly, in part, yes. I'm working on a new edition of my logic book. Currently, the current edition is the 4th, so I'm working on a 5th edition, and I have issues that I want to pursue in epistemology itself, in philosophy, about the nature of human knowledge, the nature of conceptual functioning, the nature of certainty, and there's some ways in which Ayn Rand was brilliant and had these fundamental insights in this field, in epistemology. She's known for her views in ethics and politics, but in this field also she was brilliant. But there's a lot more to discover by building on those foundations, and so I want to do that. I had earlier in my life, before the Atlas Society, before the or its predecessor named the Institute for Objectivist Studies. Before I started that, I was working on various issues in epistemology, writing. Yeah, I want to get back to that as well.
Great. Well, look, David, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate you joining us on the show today. And thank you very much for listening. As always, if you've got some value from this episode, please leave a comment. And I do hope you'll join me again for another episode of Living Outside the Matrix.
Be the change you want to see. Be the change you want to see. Be the change you want to see. Be the change you want to see.